Hey everyone, my name is Bryce, and you are watching Bryce About Music. And today we are debuting a new feature where instead of going back years in the past, we are taking a look back at just the last month of music, going through some of my favorite albums to come out in the last month, some of the music that I've been listening to in that time, and there were some real good ones this month. So let's get right into it. Denzel Curry, Taboo. This is the latest album from the quietly influential South Florida rapper who has only really gotten big outside of that scene in the last couple of years. And his latest album is not only his most ambitious album, without a doubt, but I would argue the most ambitious album to come from the SoundCloud rap scene that he has had such a prominent influence on in the last 8 years. This is a much more personal and darker album than anything Denzel Curry has done in the past, and it divides into 3 separate parts, light, gray, and dark, but the album ends up flowing really well because of the concept, as you have all of these varied sounds that are scattered throughout the album as the album builds more in its lyrical themes than it does in its specific sound, so you end up with a ton of diversity, and it really shows off Denzel's improvement as an MC and especially as a songwriter. And this really does feel like a breakthrough from Denzel, as he's pulling from so many different styles and shows that his usually very intense rapid-fire flow has more to it than just what he showed on Imperial, a mixtape that I really liked from a couple of years ago. But this album is not just all trap bangers. There's a lot more depth to it, and there's a lot of Denzel on this record. It really is a showcase for him, and there's very few features, but the ones that are here are excellent and work to splice up the album very nicely. Jid and Gold Link both have excellent verses, and towards the end of the album, JPEG Mafia and Zillamaki team up for one of the hardest hitting tracks of the year. And overall, I'm honestly blown away by Taboo. I think this is one of the best albums of the year, one of the best hip-hop albums to come out in recent years. It's just so intense and abrasive musically, while also showing Curry's depth as a lyricist, and there's really not much more that you can ask for a SoundCloud rap or trap album. It's just a masterful release, and at this point, I think you have to take Denzel Curry seriously as one of the best MCs in hip-hop right now. Imperial Triumphant, Vile Luxury. This is the follow-up to the New York avant-garde black metal band's excellent 2015 release, Abyssal Gods, and this one follows in some of the same footsteps. They're a band that gets compared quite a bit to Deathspell Omega, and I get why, as they pull from some of the same very bleak, atmospheric types of black metal and tech death. But Imperial Triumphant are much more lo-fi, more distorted, and on this album in particular, there is a much larger jazz influence on their music. Like actual jazz music. This feels to me like the culmination of other blackened jazz projects like Shining's Black Jazz or Colin Stetson's XI, as it encompasses everything that makes black metal raw and powerful, and those jazz sections work perfectly within that chaos and desolate atmosphere. And there's a rich variety to the way that the jazz passages are used. It never sounds like a gimmick, and it isn't on every track, but it works to break things up nicely and only adds to the just disgusting and vile atmosphere that Imperial Triumphant have created here, and all of the dissonance of their sound. It ends up being without a doubt my favorite metal record to come out this year, and it takes misanthropic sounding black metal to another level. Birds in Row, We Already Lost the World. This is the latest album from one of my favorite bands in the vibrant French hardcore scene, and this is easily their most fully realized album yet. There's a lot of bands that mix hardcore punk and metal, and certainly comparisons to Converge are warranted, but this is one of the few bands that actually earns them. They get really heavy. There's just such an impact to the heavier sections of their music that is lacking in a lot of their peers, Converge aside. But they mix that in with some of their strongest and most varied songwriting to date and real passionate and desperate sounding vocals. This album is simultaneously heavier and more melodic than anything they've done in the past, and it's an easy recommendation to any fan of punk or metal music. Melody's Echo Chamber, Bon Voyage, the second album from the brainchild of France's Melanie Prochet, initially starts out like your standard psychedelic pop affair, but soon you start to hear beatboxing, turntables, flutes, all sorts of other odd instruments and vocal patterns, and the album never lets go from there. It still very much has that female-fronted ethereal pop sound, clear influence from Cocteau Twins and Stereolab and all of the other standards of the genre, but this adds some much needed life, variety, and fun into that mix. And with how dynamic it is, that only ends up making the moments that are drenched in psychedelia that much more effective. It definitely can be all over the place, but if you are into modern psychedelia or into dream pop at all, 100% check this out. This is one of the more interesting releases of that style I've heard in some time. Koenji Hyakkei, Dhorimviskha, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced. A lot of this album is in a made-up language. But this is a Zool album, and it wears its magma influences on its sleeve with all sorts of chants and improvisation and abrasive switches to different styles. It's definitely in that Zool vein, but this album is somehow even more abrasive and fast and heavy than a Magma release or anything that this band has done before, as you have almost metal-like riffs juxtaposed with choral chants and operatic vocals and saxophones, and of course it switches rhythms and sounds constantly. One passage of this album will rarely last for more than 20 or 30 seconds, but after a while you just get used to the chaos. And Koenji Hyakkei is led by legendary Japanese drummer Tatsuya Yoshida, who has been in a number of different noisy Japanese bands, and this focuses much more on structure and or a lack thereof, and all sorts of jazzy choral-like sounds. So it's really interesting to hear him in this context. I think it's easily the best, most fully realized album of this project yet, and if you are into stranger progressive rock, 100%, this is a great album and a necessary listen. Laurel Halo, Raw Silk, Uncut Wood. This is a mini LP and the follow-up to Dust, an album that I absolutely loved last year. But this is a much more minimalist, slower album from Laurel Halo. Essentially, this is an ambient album that takes heavy influence from electroacoustic music, but it plays with texture and tempo in some really unexpected ways throughout. It's again a very different album for Laurel Halo, and maybe not the starting point that I would recommend for anyone. I highly recommend checking out Dust from last year, but this is a very interesting and effective follow-up and shows a different side of Laurel Halo than we've seen before. Raime, Am I Using Content or Is Content Using Me? This is the latest EP from the British production duo that has largely been an ambient project throughout their career, but I've always really enjoyed how they use space and silence on their records. I think they've always had an incredible atmosphere to their music. And this EP is a little bit different. It's much more aggressive with harder drums and plenty of vocal samples, particularly from grime MCs, but it still uses the duo's penchant for atmosphere and space exceptionally well. It's certainly a different sound for Raime, and maybe one that I prefer as a short EP than a full-length project, but I still really enjoyed hearing them in this context and applying the aspects of their sound that I really like to something that is much more active. Pram, Across the Meridian. This is the first album in 11 years from the British experimental rock band, and their first without lead vocalist Rosie Cookston. Sam Olsen, who was a background vocalist for much of Pram's career, ends up taking lead on this album. And honestly, I'm not completely in love with the vocals. I think Sam sometimes sings a little bit too much like Rosie, and that ends up not being the most effective tactic. And this album is not as good as Pram classics like Dark Island or Museums of Imaginary Animals, but it's still great to have Pram back and exploring more of the jazzy side of their music. The real strength of Across the Meridian is that Pram can switch between noir-like atmosphere and whimsical pop stylings in a very quick succession and make it flow extremely well in doing so. And there's not a whole lot in music right now that has Pram's mixture of art pop and dark jazz and post-rock. It's a unique sound, and their focus on more instrumental songs and longer instrumental passages allows them to do something different and explore a different side of their music, one that is much more influenced by jazz this time. So welcome back, Pram. We've missed you. I've missed you. And those were some of my favorite albums to come out in the past month. Let me know what your favorite albums of July 2018 are in the comments. Agree with anything on the list, disagree with anything, let me know in the comments as well. And make sure to subscribe to Bryce About Music for more videos like this. We'll be doing this at the end of every month going forward. And we'll also have more countdowns coming soon where we look at the 10 best albums of years in the past. And as always, you can give this video a like down below if you enjoyed it. And there's some more Bryce About Music videos that you can click on near my head over here. So thanks again, much appreciate it. I'm out.